Grandpa's name was Henry, a man in his late 70s with a calm face that carried the weight of both wisdom and loneliness. His hair, once thick and black, had turned silver, and his hands bore the marks of years spent building, fixing, and caring for the home that had sheltered his family for decades. Henry was a man of routine and values, someone who believed deeply in family, in togetherness, and in keeping traditions alive. He always said that a family without traditions was like a tree without roots. It might look alive for a while, but it couldn't stand strong forever. For Henry, Christmas wasn't just a holiday. It was a sacred time that bound generations together. Every year, no matter how busy life became, he had kept the celebration alive in the same house where he and his late wife, Margaret, had raised their children. The house itself carried the soul of his memories. It was old now, with creaking floorboards and walls lined with family photos that told the story of a lifetime. In the living room, the fireplace still stewed strong, a place where stockings had once hung and where laughter had once filled the air. The Christmas ornaments were packed neatly in boxes that Henry had carefully labeled over the years. Each one had a story, some handmade by his children in school, others given to him and Margaret on their first Christmas together. Though Margaret was no longer there, her touch lingered in every corner of the home. Henry often caught himself speaking to her photo, asking her advice on small things like which tablecloth to use or which cookies to bake, as if she was still by his side. Despite the ache of her absence, Henry remained hopeful. Christmas was approaching, and he imagined the sound of car doors slamming in the driveway, the front door swinging open, and little feet running across the hallway. He pictured his grandchildren's laughter echoing through the rooms, his children sitting around the table, and the warmth of family filling the emptiness that had settled in since Margaret's passing. For him, these moments weren't just about celebration. They were about feeling alive, about knowing he still belonged. Though loneliness clung to him on most days, Henry chose not to dwell on it during this time of year. Instead, he poured his heart into preparations, believing that if he made everything just right, his family would surely come and share the holiday with him. He rehearsed the welcome he would give them, imagined the joy of handing out the gifts he had carefully wrapped, and held on to the belief that this Christmas could still be special. Deep down, he feared being forgotten, but the hope of togetherness was stronger. It was that hope that kept the fire burning in his heart as he waited for his family to return to the house that had always been their home. Grandpa Henry began preparing for Christmas long before the date itself. The first sign of the season came when he pulled out the old cardboard boxes from the attic, their edges worn from years of use. Inside them were decorations carefully wrapped in tissue paper, ornaments his children had made out of paper and glue when they were young, glass baubles Margaret had chosen on their trips to town, and the little angel that always crowned the tree. He carried the boxes down slowly, his knees aching with every step, but he did not complain. For him, this was sacred work. He started with the cleaning. The house, though tidy, seemed to need a deeper touch when Christmas approached. Henry dusted the picture frames that lined the hallway, stopping often to look at the faces smiling back at him. His eyes lingered on Margaret's photo the longest. "You'd laugh at me," he whispered to the frame, scrubbing the floors like a young man. He smiled faintly, but his voice trembled. He polished the dining table until it shone, laid out the old red tablecloth Margaret had stitched herself, and checked that every chair was steady, imagining each of his children and grandchildren taking their seats. Cooking came next, and with it a flood of memories. Henry opened Margaret's worn recipe book, its pages yellowed and stained from decades of use. He ran his finger across her handwriting, feeling as though she were guiding him still. He prepared her famous spice cookies, the ones the children used to sneak from the tray before dinner. He roasted nuts, baked bread, and even attempted the fruitcake she always made, though his version never tasted quite the same. As the kitchen filled with familiar smells, Henry felt her presence. He caught himself saying aloud, "I'm doing my best, love. I think you'd be proud." The tree took the longest. Henry positioned it by the front window, just as Margaret always had, so that passers-by could see the twinkling lights. He unwrapped each ornament slowly, as if handling precious memories. He hung the lopsided snowman his son had made in kindergarten, the delicate glass star from their first Christmas together, and a string of lights that flickered now and then but still worked after all these years. When he placed the angel on top, he stepped back, his chest tightening. "There you are," he murmured, picturing Margaret lifting their youngest child so they could place it together. Each night, after the work of the day, Henry sat by the glowing tree and picked up the phone. He called his daughter, reminding her of the Christmas dinner. She assured him, "Of course, Dad. We'll be there." His son promised the same, adding, "The kids are looking forward to it." Even his teenage grandchildren gave him quick, distracted replies, but they agreed they'd come. Henry held on to those promises as if they were gifts already wrapped. When he hung up the phone, his heart felt lighter. He walked through the house one last time, checking that everything was in place. The stockings were hung, the gifts were wrapped, the food was ready to be warmed. The house, once so quiet and lonely, now looked alive again, filled with the expectation of laughter and conversation. Standing in the center of the living room, Henry looked around with a gentle smile. "This year will be special," he whispered, almost as if saying it aloud would make it true. His eyes sparkled with hope, and for a moment, he felt like a young man again, waiting for his family to come home. On Christmas Eve, Henry rose early, his heart light with anticipation. He took extra care with his appearance, pulling out the navy blue sweater Margaret had once given him. It was slightly frayed at the sleeves, but to him it was perfect, holding the warmth of her memory. He polished his shoes, trimmed his hair in the bathroom mirror, and even dabbed on a touch of aftershave, the same one he had worn for decades. "Can't be welcoming the family looking like an old mess," he muttered, trying to keep his voice cheerful, though the silence of the house echoed back at him. By late afternoon, the preparations were complete. The dining table was set with the good china, plates lined neatly beside folded napkins, and glasses waiting to be filled. Candles flickered, casting a soft glow across the room. The smell of roasted turkey and fresh bread drifted from the kitchen, wrapping the house in a comforting warmth. In the living room, the fireplace crackled to life, logs hissing as they caught the flame. Henry leaned back in his armchair for a moment, listening to the fire's hum, and then glanced out the window toward the driveway. Any moment now, he thought, headlights would sweep across the lawn, and the sound of laughter would carry through the door. But the minutes passed, then an hour, then two. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Henry's eyes shifted constantly from the driveway to the clock, back again, his anticipation slowly giving way to unease. He picked up his phone from the mantelpiece and checked for messages. Nothing. He frowned, then dialed his son's number. It rang once before a text buzzed in. "Sorry, Dad. Too busy with work. Won't make it this year." Henry's chest tightened. He placed the phone back on the table, staring at it as though it had betrayed him. A little later, a second message appeared. His daughter this time. "The kids are tired, Dad. We'll celebrate another time." He read it twice, as if the words might change. The promise she'd made just days before echoed bitterly in his ears. "Of course, Dad. We'll be there." He typed a reply. "I understand. Merry Christmas." Then erased it before sending. What was there to say? As the hours stretched on, Henry checked again and again, hoping at least his grandchildren might call. No messages came. No cheerful emojis. No quick Merry Christmas, Grandpa. Nothing but silence. He swallowed hard and looked around the decorated room, at the empty chairs that had been set so carefully for each member of his family. The turkey cooled on the counter, untouched. The candles burned lower, their wax dripping slowly onto the holders. Finally, Henry sat down at the head of the table. The plates gleamed back at him, untouched, waiting for hands that would not reach for them. He folded his hands together and bowed his head. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply breathing in the stillness. His eyes drifted to the photo of Margaret on the wall, her gentle smile forever frozen in time. He raised his gaze to her and whispered, "Looks like it's just me again." His voice cracked as the words left him, a whisper swallowed by the empty room. He thought of all the years before, when this table had been filled with laughter, arguments, and the sound of children tearing into wrapping paper. Now it was only him, a solitary figure in a house that had once been alive with joy. He forced himself to take a bite of the turkey, though it tasted of ashes in his mouth. The silence pressed in on him, heavier than any snowfall outside. As the clock chimed midnight, Henry pushed back his chair and stood slowly. He walked to the fireplace, staring at the flames that had burned so brightly, now dimming. His shoulders sagged, and he whispered again to Margaret's photo. "I tried, love. I really tried." A single tear rolled down his cheek, catching in the faint light of the fire. In that moment, surrounded by the emptiness of broken promises, Henry realized that this Christmas was not just another lonely night. It was a reminder that the family he had once held so close was slipping further and further away. Henry sat quietly at the table, the flicker of candlelight casting long shadows across the room. The silence around him seemed to press against his chest, until his thoughts, unbidden, began to wander back to other Christmases, Christmases that felt like another lifetime. He could almost hear it again. The shrieks of laughter as children tore down the stairs in their pajamas, their little feet thundering against the wooden steps. Wrapping paper would fly in every direction as they scrambled under the tree, searching for gifts with their names scribbled on tags. "Careful now. Don't rip them all at once," Margaret used to call, her voice warm and musical, though she'd laugh just as loudly as the children when they ignored her and dived headfirst into the pile of gifts. Henry would sit by the fireplace, his coffee growing cold as he watched the joy unfold. Those mornings had been his happiest hours, his heart fuller than any stocking. He remembered Margaret most vividly, standing by the piano in the corner of the living room. She loved carols. Her voice, though not trained, carried a sweetness that filled the house. She would sing Silent Night while their daughter accompanied her on the piano. The rest of the family gathered around. Henry had often joined in, his voice low and rough, but Margaret always smiled at him as though he were the finest singer she'd ever heard. The memory of her voice, so tender, made the current silence all the heavier. He looked at the piano now, its cover closed, gathering dust. No carols, no singing, just the echo of what once was. The kitchen, too, carried its ghosts. Henry thought of the chaos of Margaret's cooking, pots clattering, steam filling the windows, the smell of roasting turkey drifting through every room. She would scold him for sneaking bites before dinner, though she always did it with a grin. The children would run in and out, trying to steal cookies, and Margaret would pretend to be stern before slipping them an extra treat when she thought Henry wasn't looking. Now the kitchen was spotless, quiet, too orderly for his liking. The turkey he had roasted sat untouched, cooling on the counter, waiting for plates that would remain empty. He remembered the dining table overflowing with food, Margaret seated at one end, him at the other, the children between them. Laughter rose like music, conversations overlapped, and glasses clinked in toast to health and happiness. Sometimes the kids argued, sometimes the teenagers sulked, but the noise was life itself, and Henry had cherished every second of it. Tonight, though, that same table felt like a cruel reminder. The polished plates gleamed too brightly, the chairs stood too neatly, and the only sound was the fire's faint crackle. Henry closed his eyes, holding those memories close, letting them play in his mind like a film. The contrast cut him deeply, the then and the now. The house that had once been a stage for joy had become a shell of silence. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the absence of belonging. He felt as though the world had moved forward, leaving him behind, an old man trapped in yesterday. And yet, despite the ache, Henry found himself bowing his head. "Lord," he murmured softly, "watch over them tonight. Keep them safe, keep them happy, even if they don't have time for me." His voice trembled, but his prayer was sincere. He wanted his children and grandchildren to live full lives, to laugh and love, even if it meant forgetting him. Still, deep inside, he wished they would remember the man who had built their home, who had carried traditions, who had once been the center of it all. The memories lingered around him like ghosts, bittersweet and beautiful. And though Henry's heart ached with the silence, he held on to the only thing he could: hope. Hope that one day, they might remember the warmth of this house, and the man who kept its spirit alive year after year, even when he sat alone. Henry sat in the quiet dining room long after the clock had struck midnight. The food on the table had grown cold, and the candles had nearly burned themselves out, little puddles of wax pooling at their bases. He could have let bitterness take hold. He had every reason to. But instead, something steady arose within him. He refused to let the night end in anger. He would not give loneliness the power to define Christmas. With slow, deliberate movements, he stood and walked to the kitchen. He plated a generous portion of turkey, spooned stuffing beside it, and added a slice of the fruitcake that never quite tasted like Margaret's. He carried the plate back to the table and sat down at his usual place, at the head. He lit 2 fresh candles, their flames bright against the dim room, and for a moment he felt less alone. "Margaret," he whispered toward the chair opposite his, "I saved you your place." Like always, the empty chair seemed to glow faintly in the candlelight, and Henry allowed himself to imagine her there, smiling, reaching for the breadbasket, teasing him for overcooking the vegetables. He bowed his head and gave thanks, speaking aloud as if she were listening, just as he had done so many Christmases before. The sound of his own voice broke the heavy silence, and though it trembled, it steadied him. As he ate, he remembered her word from years ago, spoken one winter evening when he had been upset about something at work. "Don't let loneliness take away your joy," she had said, her hand resting on his. The memory returned now with startling clarity, and he found himself nodding. "You're right, love. You're always right," he murmured. He took another bite, savoring it more carefully, not because it was perfect, but because it was something he had made with love. When he finished his meal, Henry rose and walked to the small table by the Christmas tree. A single wrap package sat there, neat with a red ribbon tied on top. He had wrapped it himself earlier in the week, smiling at the thought of giving himself at least one gift, just in case the others forgot. He chuckled softly as he picked it up, the paper crinkling in his hands. "From me, to me," he said, shaking his head. Inside was a leather-bound book he had wanted for a long time, one filled with poems he and Margaret used to read together. He opened it carefully, running his fingers across the pages as though they were treasures. On the mantel rested another small box he had tucked away. This one held a polished pocket watch, engraved with his initials. He had bought it months ago, telling himself it would be something to pass down, though now he wasn't sure who would cherish it. Still, as he held it in his palm, he smiled. The watch ticked steadily, a reminder that life, no matter how lonely, still moved forward. Henry leaned back in his chair and looked around the room. The house was quiet, yes, but in the glow of the candles and the tree lights, it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive in a different way, because he had chosen to keep it that way. He had chosen not to surrender to despair. With resilience and quiet dignity, Henry claimed the night for himself. "This year will still be special," he whispered, his voice firm now. And as he closed his eyes, he felt Margaret's presence close beside him, as if she approved of the way he had carried her words into the heart of another Christmas. On Christmas morning, Henry rose slowly, his body stiff from a night spent half awake in his armchair. The tree lights still twinkled faintly, their soft glow casting little patterns on the living room wall. For a brief moment, before his thoughts caught up with him, he almost allowed himself to imagine the sound of little feet on the stairs, voices shouting "Merry Christmas, Grandpa." But the house was silent, as it had been the night before. The stockings hung untouched, the wrapped gifts still sat neatly beneath the tree, and the dining table looked more like a shrine to absence than a place for celebration. He carried his coffee to the front porch, the cold air biting against his cheeks. Snow covered the lawn, fresh from the night before, crisp and undisturbed except for the tracks of small animals. He stood quietly, sipping slowly, when the muffled sound of voices drifted across the street. 2 neighbors were talking just beyond his gate, their words carried by the morning air. Henry wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but when he heard his family's name, his chest tightened. "Yes, they were all at Susan's house last night," one neighbor said brightly. "You should have seen the cars lined up down the street. Looked like half the town was there." Henry froze, his coffee cup trembling in his hands. Susan, his niece. His family had gathered at her house. They had such a beautiful dinner, the other neighbor replied. The children were running around, and I heard they even sang carols. It must have been wonderful, all of them together like that. Henry's breath caught. He stepped back into the shadow of his porch, gripping the wooden railing as though it might steady the sudden storm inside him. The voices continued, light and cheerful, but each word cut him deeper. His family hadn't simply been too tired, too busy, or too distracted. They had celebrated Christmas without him. He set the coffee down on the porch ledge, his hand shaking so badly he nearly spilled it. The truth was like ice settling in his bones. They hadn't forgotten him. They had chosen not to include him. Every excuse they had given was a lie, a cover for the fact that they gathered elsewhere, laughed elsewhere, shared joy elsewhere, while he sat alone, waiting by a fire that had burned down to embers. Inside, Henry sank into his chair by the dining table. The chairs around it, still set with plates and cutlery, seemed to stare back at him with cruel emptiness. His gaze fixed on them, his face drawn and pale. They had Christmas, without me, he whispered, his voice almost too soft to hear. The words hung in the air like a final judgment. He pressed his palms flat on the table, feeling its polished surface cool beneath his skin. Every mark, every scratch in the wood told a story of the family that had once gathered there. But now it was only a relic, like him, a piece of the past that no one wanted anymore. He looked toward Margaret's photo on the wall, his throat tight. Did we do something wrong? He asked quietly. Did I? The silence offered no answer. Only the steady tick of the grandfather clock filled the room. The weight of the realization pressed down on him. He was no longer at the center of his family. He was no longer the host, the father, the grandfather everyone came home to. He had become an outsider in his own bloodline, someone they could cast aside without a second thought. For a long time, Henry didn't move. He sat there, staring at the empty chairs, the table set for a family that never arrived. His heart ached with betrayal, but beneath the pain was something even heavier, acceptance. He knew now, with a clarity that hurt more than the lies, that the house no longer meant to them what it meant to him. The traditions he had guarded for so long lived only in his memory. He sat in the stillness, the candle wax hardened, the food cold, the tree lights flickering weakly. It was Christmas morning, but for Henry, it felt like the end of something much greater, the end of the place he once held in his family's world. Henry rose from the table slowly, the ache in his chest heavier than the stiffness in his legs. He couldn't sit there anymore, not with the silence pressing in on him, not with the truth still ringing in his ears. He moved through the house in measured steps, his hand brushing along the backs of the chairs, the edges of the sideboard, the frames that lined the walls. Each piece of furniture, each photograph, each decoration carried with it a memory, a fragment of a life that had once been full. He paused at the mantel where Margaret's photo rested. Her smile was as familiar as the beat of his own heart. He touched the edge of the frame gently, his thumb brushing the glass. Maybe they don't want this place anymore, he whispered, his voice shaking. Maybe they don't want me. The words stung as soon as they left his lips, but saying them aloud made the thought real, undeniable. He wandered into the living room, where the Christmas tree still glowed faintly. Ornaments hung from its branches, some chipped and faded, others gleaming. Each one had a story. The glass angel Margaret had bought their first year together, the little wooden train his son had carved in shop class, the paper star his daughter made when she was just 6 years old. Henry reached for the star now, brittle with age, and held it delicately in his hand. I kept it all, he murmured. I kept everything for them. As he stood there, the weight of choice settled on him. His mind was a storm of questions, a debate he'd never wanted to face. Should he forgive them, let this betrayal pass, and keep holding on to the hope that one day they'd return? Or should he finally let go of the illusions, the waiting, the idea that family loyalty meant the same to them as it did to him? The silence of the house gave him the answer. He thought of Christmas Eve, of the table set for ghosts. He thought of the laughter he hadn't heard, the embraces he hadn't received. Forgiveness seemed too easy for what they had done, not just forgetting him, but excluding him on purpose. A new clarity formed in his heart. If they didn't value him, if they didn't value this home and everything it stood for, then he would not bind himself to them with his last act on this earth. Henry's steps carried him into his study. He opened the desk drawer, pulling out a folder with his legal papers. His will was there, neatly signed and witnessed. For years, it had said the same thing, that the house, the savings, and the keepsakes would go to his children. But now, as he sat at the desk, he felt a calm resolve settle over him. That would change. He reached for the phone and dialed his lawyer, a man he had known for decades. "James," Henry said, steady but firm, "I need to make some changes." "Yes, today. As soon as possible." By the afternoon, the revisions were in motion. The house would not go to the children who had abandoned it. Instead, it would pass to someone who had shown him care and kindness. Perhaps Mrs. Turner, the neighbor who always brought him soup when she knew he was unwell. Or maybe the local church that had welcomed him every Sunday, where the children still ran to hug him as though he were family. And a portion, he decided, would go to charity, a home for the elderly, so others wouldn't have to feel the sting of being forgotten on Christmas. As the decision solidified, Henry felt lighter, as though a burden he had carried too long had finally been set down. He wasn't doing it out of spite. He was doing it out of truth. His legacy would not reward indifference. It would honor love, wherever he had found it. That night, he stood once more in the living room, looking at the tree, the lights reflecting in his tired eyes. "Margaret," he said softly, "I think you'd approve. They don't want this house, but someone else will. Someone who cares." And for the first time that Christmas, Henry felt peace, not because his family had remembered him, but because he had remembered himself. The knock came 3 days after Christmas. Henry had been expecting it, not the visit itself, but the guilt that would eventually drive it. When he opened the door, his son stood there with his daughter just behind him, their spouses lingering awkwardly near the steps. The grandchildren didn't even look up from their phones. Inside, the air was different. The lawyer had already collected copies of the signed documents, and several boxes sat stacked in the hallway where Henry had begun clearing shelves and closets. The living room felt lighter, emptier, as if the house itself already knew it was no longer theirs. "Dad," his son began, his voice uncertain, "we should have come on Christmas. Things got complicated, but—" Henry raised a hand, silencing him. His face was calm, not angry, but his eyes carried a weight they weren't used to seeing. "You left me alone on Christmas," he said evenly. "That was your last Christmas in this house." The words hung in the air like a gavel striking wood. His daughter's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "Dad, this is our home, our family home. You can't just—" "I can," Henry interrupted gently. "And I have. The house no longer belongs to you. I've made arrangements." He gestured toward the boxes, toward the cleared shelves where family photos had once stood. "I don't need to explain further." Shock rippled through them. His son stepped forward, his voice breaking. "Dad, please, we made a mistake. We're sorry. We'll do better. Don't shut us out like this." Henry looked at him, his expression pained but steady. "I didn't shut you out. You did that yourselves. You made your choice when you gathered elsewhere and left me here waiting. Now I've made mine." Tears welled in his daughter's eyes as she reached for him. "Please, Dad, we'll make it right. Just don't take the house away from us." Henry's jaw tightened. He wanted to soften, to give in to their pleas, but the memory of that silent Christmas Eve cut too deeply. He thought of the empty chairs, the texts filled with excuses, the laughter that had belonged to someone else's home. His voice was quiet, but it carried finality. "You chose once. I choose now." The room fell silent. His children stood there, stunned, unable to argue further. For the first time, they understood that Henry wasn't bending, not this time.